Hi everybody, it's Professor Elam. We're in Unit 3 right now. We will be finishing up our readings in Greek literature. We have one Greek tragedy by Sophocles, Oedipus the King, or Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus Tyrannus. Perhaps some of you have heard those other titles for the play. We'll also be looking at a selection of Roman authors, Virgil and Horace. We won't be looking at the other two major Roman authors, Ovid and Lucan. I may mention them over the course of the lecture, but we're only reading Virgil and Horace. And then our Vaith readings cover, among other things, they cover matters of language. That's what I will focus on. If the video seems choppy to you, it's because I'm pausing to get my lecture materials gathered together for each different section. Even though it's listed last in our reading list on the syllabus, the Vaith text I want to talk about in terms of language, and I think it lends itself, the word, for example, obscene, which means happening off of stage or out of view, lends itself to our Sophocles reading. Things that are obscene happen in the background. For example, in Oedipus the King, what happens to Jocasta doesn't happen on stage, it happens off stage. It's obscene. Now, it doesn't mean obscene in the way that we think of it, like offensive, although it could offend, as primarily offensive. It means literally out of sight. So when we think about language that is bad, and Vaith talks about different categories of bad language: profanity, vulgarity, obscenity, blasphemy, and each of those is different. They're not interchangeable terms. When Vaith talks about language, and in the nonfiction section he also mentions language. As Christians, we should be most concerned with language's ability to portray truth. Now, sometimes truth is offensive, or it describes something real that happened that may be alarming, and sometimes words that have fidelity to reality, that have a faithfulness to what really happened. Sometimes those words can strike us as alarming or off-putting in some ways. Now, don't hear me saying, oh, everybody should run out and use profanity. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that sometimes language, in order to maintain the reality or the depth of what it is presenting or communicating to an audience, sometimes language won't always be harmonious to the ear. It won't always be pleasant to the ear to hear such things. And as we read our texts through this class, there will be things that strike us as off-putting or strike discordant notes. And many of those times, if not all of those times, are because the poet or the author wants the audience to be caught up short, or wants the audience to stop or to feel a kind of abrasiveness. Not because the poet delights in antagonizing the audience, but because the poet wants to present the truth, in some cases, wants to present the truth of discomfort in certain moments. Not every narrative needs to be only ever filled with discomfort, but discomfort plays an important part in story. If you've ever read the book of Judges, for instance, you will know that discomfort characterizes most of that book. Cycles of the judges of Israel going through deliverance and captivity, deliverance and oppression, those cycles are remarkably discordant. They are remarkably unpleasant to read. And this is not a Bible course by any means. Nevertheless, the Holy Spirit, through the inspired author, does have a narrative rhythm in mind. And part of that narrative rhythm is to show just how far Israel has fallen, or if you prefer, to show the inevitable cycles of sin that dog humanity. So those are the points that I wanted to focus on in the Vaith reading. Of course, Vaith discusses many other things, but to me, those are the most salient points for our class. Nevertheless, read the entirety of those chapters. All right, so let's switch over to Sophocles now. So with Sophocles' Oedipus the King, connected to Vaith's reading, which we've already had on tragedy, we can think about this partly in Aristotelian terms. So just nod your heads like, right, Aristotelian terms, Dr. Elam. Um, or maybe think about it in the classical approach where the Greek tragedy is concerned with sin. Hamartia is the Greek word. Now, I'm not a Greek scholar, so if I'm pronouncing it wrong, then forgive me. But the idea is that sin dogs humanity. Now, one of the questions, and understandably so, that people focus on when reading Sophocles' Oedipus is, did Oedipus have free will, or was everything fated to happen to him? Was free will an illusion? Now, that is a relevant, I suppose, pathway to follow after reading Sophocles' Oedipus. But that question, in Sophocles' mind, seems answered throughout the entirety of the play. And throughout the entirety of the play, I think that the audience is to understand that Apollo, the god who is behind the scenes, and pause the class for a second. In one of the previous lectures, I mentioned that Greeks probably did not, if they thought about their gods at all, like most people don't think about God in their day-to-day lives, probably the philosophers thought about the gods in the ways that Sophocles presents him in Oedipus. Namely, he never appears on stage. He's kind of a force out there doing things. He still has personhood in a sense, but not arms and legs walking around having a conversation like in Homer's portrayal. So this portrayal of the gods is probably more in line with what the Greek would think of, although I'm sure there were individuals in Greece who did believe in the gods the way Homer presents them, as having arms and legs and walking around having a dinner party. But for the most part, Sophocles sees Apollo, and he's not the only one, who sees Apollo as this force behind the scenes. And Apollo seems to have governed all of the events of Oedipus's life, and by extension the events of everybody's lives. And so the matter of, do we really have free will or not, could Oedipus have changed his fate, is not really the matter that Sophocles is exploring. It seems like Sophocles is exploring the matter of, can fate be understood in terms of who a person is? So I've got in my office, I have 3 different translations of Oedipus, probably actually 4 now that I'm looking at my bookshelf. I think there are some in some anthologies that I have. Now, Bagg's note, so for our class, we've assigned the Bagg translation. Bagg's note at the end, it's on page 133, he points out that the end of the play is not so much Sophocles saying, this is what I've been talking about the whole time, as it is a way also, so I don't want to be dismissive of this because it's important, the way something ends is important, but as a way also to get the chorus off stage. So just like the Homeric epithet really does tell us about the characters that the epithets are attached to, but also it helps to fulfill poetic meter. So also the end of a play facilitates the chorus getting off stage. So the end of the play, I'm going to read the 3 different translations that I have about the end, on the end of Oedipus. So this translation, which is in the Dover Thrift edition, is Sir George Young's translation, probably early 1900s, so early 20th century. The chorus's words are these: dwellers. These are the final lines of the play. Dwellers in Thebes, behold this Oedipus, the man who solved the riddle marvelous, a prince of men whose lot, what citizen did not with envy see? How deep the billows of calamity above him roll. Watch therefore and regard that supreme day, and of no mortal say that man is happy till, vexed by no grievous ill, he passed life's goal. All right, so that's Sir George Young. I also have David Green's translation of Oedipus, probably a very well-known, widely read version. His translation of the chorus's final words are these: you that live in my ancestral Thebes, behold this Oedipus. him who knew the famous riddle and was a man most masterful. The famous riddle is the riddle of the Sphinx, which is not portrayed in this play, but it's alluded to, it's talked about. Not a citizen who did not look with envy on his lot. See him now, and see the breakers of misfortune swallow him. Look upon that last day always. Count no mortal happy till he has passed the final limit of his life, secure from pain. And then our translation by Robert Bagg. The choruses, the final lines of the play by the chorus are these. Thebans, that man is the same Oedipus whose great mind solved the famous riddle. He was a most powerful man, which of us, seeking his glory, his prestige, did not wish his luck could be ours. Now look at what wreckage the seas of savage trouble have made of his life. To know the truth of a man, wait till you see his life end. On that day, look at him. Don't claim any man is God's friend until he has passed through life and crossed the border into death, never having been God's victim. So one of the words, if you read Bagg's note, one of the words that features in this final line is the word pathon. We get our word pathos from it, or feeling. In this case, it would be something like toil or anguish. So it looks like what Sophocles is exploring, among other things, is what it means to be in the hands of the gods. And by implication, it seems like Sophocles is saying, don't envy the position, the greatness of the great positions of the great, or the high positions of the great, because God may have them as a victim, as some kind of a victim. Now, in studies of ancient literature that focus on the concept of the hero, which is a way of focusing on ancient literature, those studies will emphasize the need of the hero to undergo suffering. This is heavily explored by writers like Joseph Campbell in The Hero of a Thousand Faces. So, Oedipus is a deliverer of his city initially because he answers the riddle of the Sphinx, which is not portrayed in our play, but he delivers them from this plague of the Sphinx. However, a new plague has come to Thebes, not Athens, but Thebes, an ancient principal city in Greece. And this plague, Oedipus says, just like I delivered you from the plague of the Sphinx, I'm going to deliver you from the plague against us now. And he has to investigate this murder. And some people also, for example, I took a class on detective fiction, and the first thing that we read in detective fiction was Oedipus the King. And our professor noted that Oedipus is investigating like a detective, but the point was that the detective is investigating a threat to society. He's investigating sin. He needs to uncover sin so that it could be addressed and punished. Now, in a Christian perspective, we know that God has addressed this matter of sin in the incarnation of Christ and has given a way for us to be delivered from sin if we trust in Jesus. Now, I'll come back to that in a bit here because I want to focus on the text. So, curiously enough, Oedipus is the one who suffers the sin. And when he makes these proclamations about we will find and root out this sin, he's talking about himself. When he says, if anybody in here is harboring sin in his household, they need to be exiled. His words are probably a little stronger than that. Well, the audience knows that he's talking about himself. They already know how this play is going to work, right? Sophocles was not the first person to write about Oedipus. The other two main Greek playwrights that we study, Aeschylus and Euripides, they too wrote Oedipus plays and addressed this matter. So the audience knows how this is going to end, right? They know that the person who's at fault is Oedipus. What they don't know is how Sophocles is going to deal with this. Now, in Aeschylus's play, for example, Oedipus, the blinding of Oedipus, which is a very famous moment in Sophocles' play. In Aeschylus's play, it's a servant who blinds Oedipus. And in Euripides' play, Jocasta's fate is different from her fate in Sophocles' play. So she, I don't want to spoil too much, but what happens to Jocasta in Sophocles' Oedipus the King, which we are reading, does not happen to her in Euripides' play. So there are different ways that playwrights deal with this material, and Sophocles' treatment seems to emphasize the lack of knowledge the hero has, or Sophocles. Let's not talk in generic terms. Let's talk in specific terms. The lack of knowledge that Sophocles has about his own sin, and that his sin is the real problem dogging his citizens. Now, I believe, and I think most readers, most scholars would agree, Oedipus genuinely cares about Thebes insofar as he's willing to seek out the cause of the plague and eliminate it from the city. So I don't think that's him putting on airs or him being disingenuous. His problem, though, or part of his problem, is that he's hot-headed and he's a braggart. He is somebody who is withdrawn, right? He thinks that everybody is against him. Not withdrawn like he goes and isolates himself, but feels like there are these plots against him. His hot-headedness becomes an important point throughout the play, the way he reacts to Tiresias, who is the first person to come right out and say, look, the problem happening to Thebes is you. You are the problem, Oedipus. He's the first person to say that. And then finally Oedipus, over the course of the play, realizes, oh my goodness, I am the problem. But the problem is not the circumstances of his life. The problem is, it really is him. When he finds out that he is the one who has killed his father, and has that realization, he's remembering a moment when he, in his hot-headedness, in his ability to be angered, easily becoming angered, has attacked a man on the road and his servants and killed them all, except for one who, of course, is able to report the attack. But this is because he's hot-headed. He is impulsive. He, again, he at the drop of a hat, he says, "Oh, you and Tiresias, you and Creon must be, or Creon, depending on how you pronounce it, you must be against me, conspiring against me to take the kingdom from me." He runs away from his town of, I think it's Corinth, where he is living, to get away from this prophecy. Because he wants to get away. So these impulses to run, these impulses to do things his own way are part of who he is. And Sophocles is presenting Oedipus, yes, the victim of the god, but the victim of the god because Oedipus is who he is. So now one might ask, like, well, what do we do about this, right? Paul says, like, woe is me, right? The sin is always with me. The things I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, I do. Who will, wretched man that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death? And then he goes on and says, thanks be to God. So there is this idea even in the ancient world that God punishes sin, and that also that punishment for sin seems also to be interwoven into who we are. As broken people, we can do nothing but sin. Now, I mean, kind of in this ultimate sense, right? I know that we do, non-Christians do good deeds, and they do good to each other, and even to Christians, and so on and so forth. So I'm not claiming there is no good ever in the world. What I'm saying is that there is no good that transcends our fallen condition. For the Greek, this is bad news, right? We remember in Homer, we see the despair as people on the battlefield suffer at the whims of the gods, and occasionally a god has pity on them. The difference between those gods and the Christian God, of course, is that the Christian God makes the way for the payment. The victim of sin, who has to pay the price, pay the penalty for sin, is Christ. He's the one who does this. I mean, we can be punished for sin, but we can't pay for our sin. So Christ undergoes the punishment, and in doing so, makes payment. So I know, even though there's this devotional application, which we should be mindful of, right? We're at Regent University. We all know what Regent University stands for. We as faculty are committed Christians, so that we can't skirt around that issue. That's an important issue. Also, we need to understand that for the ancient mind, they don't have this concept, right? They don't have or at least they don't have the benefit of the revealing of Jesus, right? The life of Jesus and the revelation that is for us. They're doing the best that they can. But they can recognize that sin is really something in this world. It's a powerful force that we can't extract ourselves from. And Christians reading Oedipus and seeing what happens to him, we should nod our heads and say, "Yep, that's about right. That's what the human condition is." And this can play, so pause for a second, pause our discussion of Oedipus for a second. This could be, for instance, a way to ground your reflective paper. You could say, listen, Christian audience, a benefit in reading Oedipus is that we see affirmed in the ancient pagan writers, though their minds are dark, we see affirmed in them not only that there is a sinful condition, but also that sinful condition is punished by the divine, and that sinful condition is something that we cannot escape. And so that is an affirmation for us. Now, I don't want you to go too far and then say, and therefore, we should think of Sophocles as a Christian. He's a pagan. We shouldn't think of him as a Christian. But it is a way, or it is something that we could tell this Christian audience, here is a value, here is a benefit of reading this pre-Christian literature should we pick it up. Now, there's tons more to talk about in Oedipus, right? I could go scene by scene and break these down. I just want to give you this large overview picture. Now we need to switch over to our Roman writers, and the first Roman writer I want to discuss is Horace. All right, so of the four principal Roman poets, and these, I didn't make up this, the canonical Roman poets, the Poetae Regulati. But of the four principal poets, Virgil, Ovid, Lucan, and Horace, Horace is probably the most moralizing of the four. It doesn't mean that the others they don't believe in morality. It just seems like Horace is really concerned with morality. He's concerned with piety, and even though Virgil is famous for the epithet Pius Aeneas, right? Aeneas, who is very dutiful and pious, right? Dutiful toward the gods and his family and his nation. Horace is the one who focuses in on the rights and wrongs more overtly. So we'll be reading three kinds of works, four works in total, three kinds of works. We'll be reading an epistle. That's the last of the final one in our readings. Two odes, which are like short poems, lyrical poems, and a satire. Now, these are not the only things that Horace wrote. He's probably most famous for the work The Art of Poetry, or Ars Poetica, the poetic arts. So, or the poetic art rather. So that's his most famous work, in which he argues that poetry should instruct and delight. There's more to it than that. But if you've ever heard that formulation, that comes from Horace, or is most famously expressed by Horace. We'll be looking at, the first type of work we look at is a satire. Now, Horace, let me just give you a little bit of background on his life, and check my notes here. His father was a tax collector. He saved to send Horace to school. They seem to have had a fairly good relationship. It seems like Horace remembers him well. We get the memories of his father from his writing, right, where he remembers being walked to school and all this, that, and the other thing. So there seems to have been a good relationship between him and his father. So he's writing during the time of Octavius, or Octavian. There are different ways of saying or pronouncing or spelling it. This is Caesar Augustus, whom we hear about at the opening of Luke's Gospel, the opening of the Gospels. So Octavius, Caesar Augustus, triumphs over his enemies like Brutus and Brutus who killed his father, um, uh, and others, Mark Antony, and so on and so forth. Interestingly enough, Horace fought for Brutus's army and was included in a general amnesty that Octavian or Caesar Augustus gave to those fighters. And Horace received what's known as the Sabine Farm, and it seems to have been a source of joy and happiness and peace for him throughout his lifetime. He writes about it occasionally in his writings. For example, the satire we look at, even though it doesn't mention the Sabine Farm, it still is talking about things associated with it, right, when he goes home to the country. So, and he likes to focus in on what is good, what is the right thing to do in life, how should we focus, how should we focus on, or what matters rather should we focus on in our lives. And the first satire is an example of this. And in the first satire, Horace contrasts the city life with the country life. Now, satire is just a fancy word. I mean, literally it means a dish. So it's kind of like a hodgepodge, maybe a stew or something like that. Just a hodgepodge of things, right? This satire, but literarily, what satire does is it focuses in on the foibles and flaws and problems of humanity in order to address them in some way. Now, satire can run the gamut of being something gentle like Horace's satire, and it's gentle because Horace sees himself as one of the people who participates in the foibles and flaws of society. It can run the gamut of being like a gentle satire to being something that is more biting and scathing. Juvenal, who we're not reading for this class, not Juvenile, but Juvenal, is very well known among the ancient writers, is very well known for his scathing, biting, harsh satire of society. And we could imagine Juvenal like pointing his finger, and you all are the problem, it's all of you, and you're making it hard for the rest of us. And that Juvenalian satire, we find all kinds of satire surviving into our world today. One of the great examples from my past, it would be The Simpsons. I don't know if they're still making episodes of The Simpsons, but it's a kind of satire that pokes fun at the flaws of humanity. The work done by Stephen Colbert is satire. Jon Stewart's Daily Show, satire, right, where they kind of like zero in on problems with humanity in order to point them out, criticize them in some way. And Horace's satire is on the gentler end of that criticism, right? He sees himself in this satire as part of this flawed system. He says, I have to go into the city, and I have to be, my work means involving myself in the daily gossip. And he does even confess in the satire. He says, look, I kind of like it. I kind of like that people are asking me, like, is this person on the ins or the outs? What's going to happen with so and such and such? He says, I like that. But really what I look forward to is going home at the end of the day to my family farm and listening to our old neighbor wax eloquently about matters of morality. And then it closes up with the city and the town mouse story, or a version of that. Not Aesop's version, but it's that kind of story is all around the ancient world. So Horace closes his satire with this discussion of the city mouse versus the country mouse. And of course, the emphasis is that the country mouse, in his little country life, is delivered from the anxieties and dangers of urban life. And now, for those of us who have lived in cities before, we know that the country for us can pose its own kinds of problems, right? It's no accident that a lot of horror movies take place in the country. Um, but this is Horace's perspective, right? We could do this with anything, right? The city is the center of virtue, and the country is the center of danger, or the city is the center of danger, and the country is the center of virtue. Horace really does believe, he doesn't have necessarily take that open view that I'm taking, but he really does believe that the country is better. Now, for those of us now who live in the suburbs, what do, right? We live in the nondescript suburbs, the bland suburbs. Horace doesn't really explore that. For those of you who have poetic inclinations, maybe you could write an apology for why the suburbs are good, and maybe the suburbs could be a place that you could withdraw to and find solace in. I think plenty of criticism of the suburbs has already been done. I'd like to see maybe more apologetics for the suburbs. We won't do that in our class. That would be something for creative writing. Anyway, the next readings that we have are two odes by Horace, in which the first ode, I think it's 134 is the first one. Yes, so this is his first collection, first book of odes. The 34th ode in there talks about wandering around, seeking wisdom apart from God until the thunder claps out of a clear sky, and it's kind of like God asserting himself, making himself known to Horace, and grabs Horace's attention. He says, "I must turn myself to God. It is better to walk with the divine." Now he is not thinking of this in a Christian sense as having having closeness to Christ, right? Christ as our Savior, whom in the Gospels Jesus calls his disciples his friends. Horace would be maybe skeptical of that idea, but he would be on board with the idea that we should pay homage to the gods. So that is something he affirms. And as Christians, we would say, yeah, it is better to walk with mindfulness, nay, devotion toward the divine rather than to ignore it. So we would agree with that. We wouldn't agree with Horace's worship of pagan gods, but we would agree with that concept overall. The other ode is Horace's ode, I think it's 216. Yes, the second book, the 16th ode, where contentment with little is better than the anxiety that possessions bring. He talks about among other things, he uses this symbol of a ship, and he says, in addition to all of the cargo on your ship, rich man, people who have great possessions, in addition to cargo that gets loaded on the ship, what else gets loaded onto the ship? Anxiety gets loaded onto the ship. So if you have much, you also get to have anxiety. You get to have uncertainty as to whether or not your cargo is going to reach its port. Will the ship sink? Will I make enough money? Will the port operators be fair to me? None of those anxieties attend the poor person. Again, I understand that in reality, poverty also brings its own anxieties, right? So I'm not denying that. Horace, however, is focusing on the idea that having great possessions brings with it a kind of anxiety that poverty, or at least not poverty, but measured possessions, gives relief from. Just give me enough, right? Give me enough to survive, enough food to eat for the day, a suitable plot of land, and that's plenty for me. He even implies this in his satire. So that's the theme being explored in Ode 216. And then we finally get to his epistle. I think it's Epistle 2:1. It's Epistle 1:2, his first collection of epistles, the second epistle, to Lollius. Now, the art of poetry expresses the idea against Plato and Socrates in the Republic that poetry is a great teacher of virtue. And his example, so in the Republic, the poets are, famously, if you haven't read it, that's okay. I have not read the whole of the Republic. I've read, the usual excerpts of it. In the Republic, Socrates, and Plato is the writer, he's presenting Socrates. Socrates is his character, or maybe it really was Socrates who said these things. In any case, he presents this idea that the poets who are propagators of lies, right? Fiction are lies, things that don't happen. That the poets are excluded from the ideal republic. Horace, who is aware of this, is answering. He doesn't bring this up necessarily overtly. He doesn't say, like, hey, I'm taking on Socrates. What he says is that poetry instructs and it delights. So it is a stylized way of expressing, right? Nobody talks the way poetry talks. Yet, poetry delights our ears and can express ideas about morality and goodness in ways that are more engaging than the philosophers, according to Horace. So in this epistle to Lollius, he says, while you are learning rhetoric, while you're declaiming in Rome, I'm reading Homer again. And I'm learning what it is to be a virtuous man by reading Homer. I get to see this fool Paris making his terrible decisions, and I get to see this wise guy Odysseus making, or Ulysses, that's the Roman name, version of his name, Ulysses making shrewd decisions. Now, we would disagree, I think. I disagree. I don't think that Odysseus is all that great an exemplar of virtue. We might disagree about who this exemplar of virtue is, but I think as Christians we would say, yeah, you know what? These literary representations of morality have great value. They really can connect with us in ways that overt philosophy cannot. In fact, Christ himself utilizes parables, which is not, we don't want to say that parables are the only kind of poetic writing we should use, or fictional writing, but he does engage with parables in order to make points that the philosophic expression, which Christ also does, that the philosophic expression can't quite encapsulate, right? Can't quite express as fully. So the fiction can't maybe give us the philosophical idea, but it can express a range of experiencing an idea that the philosophical axiom cannot. So that's Horace in a nutshell. Now let's turn our attention to Virgil. Virgil was a contemporary of Horace, and Virgil and Horace knew each other. In fact, it may have been Virgil who introduced Horace to his patron, the person who sponsored him as a poet. Virgil, like many Romans, had his ancestral land, his ancestral property at Mantua, seized and given away to soldiers returning from Roman wars abroad or civil wars in various places in the Roman Empire. So Virgil had his family farm seized from him, and then it was returned to him after a plea, probably a plea facilitated by his friend Gallus or Pollio, both of whom are mentioned in the Eclogues. So Horace, who had this Sabine farm assigned to him, or like Horace, I suppose, Virgil had this ancestral homeland. Now Horace, I don't think the Sabine farm was Horace's ancestral homeland, but the farm at Mantua was Virgil's ancestral homeland. And he explores this idea in the Eclogues. Now, before we get to that, let me say that Virgil's most famous work is probably the Aeneid, the story about Aeneas, who appears in the Iliad. He is one of the Trojan warriors who he actually stands up and fights against Achilles and is rescued in book 20, 22, 21, something like, I forgot which book number it is, maybe 21 or 22. He's rescued by Poseidon, who actually does this little punt and kicks him off the battlefield, because there was this legend in the ancient world that Aeneas survived the Trojan War and went on to found his kingdom. Now, the earliest sources place that kingdom in a region called Thrace or around there. So if you were traveling, just nod your head like, right, Dr. Elam. So if you're traveling from Turkey to Greece to like Athens across the mainland and not sailing straight across the ocean. About halfway there is where some people think Aeneas may have founded a kingdom, a city. For the ancient Romans, however, or at least for as it comes down to the ancient Romans, so Virgil doesn't make this up, but he inherits this idea. Aeneas actually sails past Greece and all the way off the map to Italy, modern day Italy, where he founds Rome. And the story of that journey is told in the Aeneid. It's his most famous work. He died before it was finished, and probably he had literary executors finish up the work. Now, we don't know whether that means they wrote the ending or whether everything was done and they just kind of cleaned it up and, for publication or whatever. But that's his most famous work. Now, he wrote a work before that called the Georgics, sometimes called the Bucolics, which is a treatise on farming. It's not really about farming. I don't think any farmer in the ancient world worth his salt would follow all of Virgil's advice, and I don't think Virgil meant for his advice to be followed. He is really using the idea of farming, animal husbandry, not botany, but I can't think of it. Agricultural work, forestry, and beekeeping. Famously in Book 4, he talks about beekeeping. He's talking about these things in order to make points about moral behavior, human society. So Virgil is also on the moral side of the Greek poets. Not quite the moralist Horace is. I think Virgil tends not to make moral pronouncements as overtly as Horace does. Virgil seems to imply them. And so he writes about this morality in the Georgics. His first major collection of works, however, are the eclogues. Eclogues mean something like selection or selections. It's an anthology of poetry. Now, Virgil, we don't think that he wrote all 10 of these eclogues in one sitting and planned them all to be part of this sequence. However, when he edited the series, they do take on this sequential quality. So in the eclogues, we get a cycle that discusses things that discusses pessimistic things and optimistic things, optimal and terrible things, and discusses them in balance. So he doesn't steer a middle course, right? He doesn't do lukewarm. He does hot and cold. He does the best and the worst. Both of those are on display in the eclogues. And the balancing factor, I think, for Virgil is a sense of hopefulness. So in the first eclogue, right away, we have two shepherds, and I know it's difficult to read the eclogues because these shepherds are not actual figures, like well-known figures from the ancient world. So, unlike Iliad or Greek tragedy or something like that, which has usually a central character or core of central famous characters on display, in the ancient world, there's also poetry that has generic figures on display, and it can make it difficult sometimes to connect because they're so generic. But we have these two farmers, Tityrus and Meliboeus, who each of whom has lost his ancestral homeland, like Virgil did. One of whom, Tityrus, has his homeland restored to him, and the other of whom, Meliboeus, doesn't. And Meliboeus is wandering around now with a vagabond with this herd of goats, and he's complaining to Tityrus. And Tityrus says, hey, look, I was in a similar situation, but I went to Rome and I found a young god there, and as Christians we understand we do not involve ourselves in emperor worship. In fact, the early Christians were persecuted heavily because they would not worship the emperor as a god. Now, that was a later emperor. It wasn't Augustus, who's the emperor at the time Virgil is writing. Nevertheless, as Christians, we would say, it does make sense to appeal to the divine if you have a complaint. We're not going to be on board with Virgil's pagan views, but we will be on board with the idea that to go to the divine, to ask for help, is something that we as Christians affirm as good, right? It is good for us to do that. Back to the eclogues. So these two shepherds meet each other, and Tityrus says, look, I was in a similar situation. I went to Rome, I appealed to Rome, and this young god, probably Caesar Augustus, restored my family farm to me, and now I have a sense of hope. Meliboeus, the other shepherd, it's unclear to me, even in the Latin, it's unclear to me whether Meliboeus intends to be snarky or sarcastic toward Tityrus. I tend to think he isn't. I tend to think he's kind of self-absorbed. Whatever the case may be, he does say, hey, look, not all of us get to have that kind of comfort. And the eclogue closes then with an invitation by Tityrus to Meliboeus, why don't you stay here tonight? Take a load off. I've got plenty of cheese. I've got plenty of I've got a meal prepared for us. And so that's kind of this hopeful strand. Now, Virgil isn't giving empty platitudes like everything's going to be okay. He doesn't do that. He addresses Meliboeus' need in the moment. And those momentary needs are the things that are being focused on. In the second eclogue, where Corydon is burning with desire, the focus is not that is not the fulfillment of the desire. The focus is on the thwarting of that desire. He doesn't get to have it fulfilled. So what does he do? He says, I will instead address my hands to other things, right? I can't have everything I want when I want it, and so I'll go and weave baskets or whatever it is he's going to do. And again, that's an expression of pessimism, right? The thing that I want I can't have, and so I'm going to do what is expedient for me. Now, the details in the second eclogue might be, it's like, oh my goodness, what he really wants is something illicit anyway. Okay, yes, I agree with that. And for Virgil, though, the focus is not whether Corydon's desires are illicit. The focus is he can't have them. And so he needs to redirect his mind to something else. And that is the kind of moralism we find in Virgil's writing. The third eclogue is the first of, I think, 4 or 5. As I count them, it's a little different each time I count them. Sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 5, depending on how I reckon the ninth eclogue. In any case, we have the first of a series of what are known as amoebian songs. So like an amoeba that splits apart and so on and so forth. So these are amoebian songs. And the amoebian singing just means that you have an exchange, a song exchange back and forth between two figures. In the third eclogue, it's a contest. In the fifth eclogue, it's not a contest, or maybe it is a contest in the fifth eclogue and not the seventh. In any case, it's not always a contest. Sometimes it is just a song exchange between friends. Here it's a contest, and this back and forth singing, you might think of it as something like if you've heard of dueling banjos, which doesn't have any words in it, where, banjo players will they'll play a theme. Somebody will start with a theme, and then the responding banjo player will either improve upon the theme or offer a variation of the theme that is a kind of like an answer to it. Epic rap battles, for example. I know it's kind of a silly example, but epic rap battles might be in the spirit of this amoebian singing, right? Where, and especially in the third eclogue, where it seems like there's some insulting going back and forth. Epic rap battles is in the spirit of this amoebian singing, this song exchange. So note that there are at least 4 places in the eclogues where we have these song exchanges, sometimes between people who are really tense with each other, and sometimes between people who are friendly with each other. And then note how Virgil manages these songs. So it seems like, for example, in eclogue, I think it's in eclogue 6, not 6, 5, it's, not Damon and Alphasebius. Let me pause for a second and go check this. Okay, so it is Eclogue 5 with Menelcas and Mopsus. So when these two shepherds meet each other, they have this exchange. So in Eclogue 3, we have this exchange about, it's like this boasting contest, like who's better, who loves me more, even the people you love me better, and this, that, and the other thing. So and again, Virgil is balancing these pessimistic views with optimistic views, right? Not doing the middle course, but doing both, and the balance on which he is resting it is a kind of hopefulness. And in the third eclogue, frustratingly maybe, there's no winner, right? No winner is declared. It's like, oh, we're all winners here. Let's stop this contest. In the fifth eclogue, it's not a contest, but it's a song exchange where the younger shepherd is given the privilege to go first by the older shepherd, and he sings about the death of this ideal shepherd figure, Daphnis, and he undergoes an apotheosis and all this kind of stuff. No, it's the death of Daphnis. The apotheosis is in the answer to it. So again, Virgil is taking this bad idea, even though the younger shepherd is not in the dregs of despair, he's still presenting kind of a negative, sad thing. It's the older shepherd who takes that negative, sad thing and then reframes it as something positive. The apotheosis, or we might think of it as the assumption or something like that, of Daphnis, this ideal shepherd figure. And for Virgil, who believed in like local deities and all that kind of nonsense, Daphnis becomes kind of like this patron god of shepherds, patron minor god of shepherds. So again, as Christians, we would say, no, we're not going to involve ourselves in that pagan local deity worship folly. Nevertheless, as Christians, we would say, you know what? There is a kind of there is value in looking at negative things like death and seeing a positive aspect of it. So even though we would repudiate Menelcas and Mopsus for their pagan outlook, we could nod in agreement with their general desire to see something positive out of the negative. Eclogue 6 is a really negative expression. It's hard to tell, but Silenus is presenting the history of the world, which Ovid does. He's one of the great Roman poets. He's in a very digest form. Silenus, this old drunk satyr, is presenting the history of the world in really negative terms, focusing on the terrible things that happen in the world. And as Christians, we would nod our heads and go, you know what? The world is a bad place. I don't think we would be on board with Silenus's attitude, but his expression of the facts, we would say, yep, that's about right. Eclogue 7 is another song exchange, as is Eclogue 8. In Eclogue 8, we have the despair of lost love balanced with the hopefulness of trying to gain love back. Eclogue 9 is kind of a reiteration of a theme found in Eclogue 1, loss, and what do we do in companionship with loss? How do we help each other? Eclogue 10 is probably Virgil taking poetry from his friend Gallus and actually incorporating it into the eclogue to console him for the loss of a relationship. Gallus apparently was dating an actress and she left him for somebody else, and this seems to be a way to kind of rally him and lift his spirits up. Again, it doesn't gloss over the problems, but it refocuses on the potential hopefulness. Now, let me circle back to Eclogue 4, because this, for Christians, is the most important eclogue. In fact, Augustine, writing in various places, talks about the fourth eclogue as evidence to Augustine, not necessarily to us or to others, but to Augustine and other early church fathers, as evidence that even the pagans had this notion that a coming golden age was possible. They expressed this desire for it. The fourth eclogue is sometimes known as the Messianic Eclogue. And it's known as that because it has a lot of imagery and language in it that seems to be similar to passages from Isaiah, where it talks about the lion lying down with the lamb, fields giving themselves or being fruitful themselves for a messianic ruler. Virgil seems to express those thoughts. Now, I happen to think that Virgil, who lived in Rome, a major metropolitan area of the time, which had a Jewish population, otherwise Paul wouldn't be writing an epistle to the Christians at Rome. So there's a Jewish population in Rome. I think Virgil probably, in his cultured circles, encountered Jewish people who valued the writings of the prophet Isaiah, who would have read them in synagogue, and was probably exposed to that writing, and it informed his writing of the fourth eclogue. Now that's speculation. I'm not alone in that, by the way. I inherited that from the people that taught me. So yeah, I'm not being super innovative in this, and this view, by the way, is centuries old. So there's nothing new in it. Nevertheless, it is curious to me that even if Virgil wasn't like divinely inspired, and I don't think he was divinely inspired, there is something providential about his encountering this Jewish prophetic writing and finding it so appealing, and maybe wanting to express that messianic hope in terms of something like nationalism, right? I know that nationalism these days has this negative quality to it. I get that. I understand. I agree with the criticism of it in part, maybe not totally, but in part. But I think that Virgil, what he's doing is saying, look, we have this transition from the Republic to the Empire. This is a moment of potential hopefulness. This is a moment maybe where we can look toward a golden age. Now we know that that's not a case because without Christ there's no possibility for a golden age. Still, this human desire for a golden age is expressed by the poet. And again, as Christians, maybe if you're writing your reflective paper, you could focus on, if you didn't focus on Iliad or Sophocles, Homer or Sophocles or whatever, you could focus on the fourth eclogue and say, you know what, Christians can value this pagan desire for a golden age, right? When the unbeliever wants something good, we shouldn't say, blah, you can't have it. We should say, if we're not in their presence, we should think, you know what, it's good. It is good to have that desire. That desire, in fact, could be a prompt for somebody to draw nearer to Christ and the truth that's expressed in the Gospels, the truth that Christ presents to us. So Virgil expresses this hopefulness in the fourth Messianic Eclogue. It is one of my favorite pieces of literature. In fact, I love the Eclogues. I chose it for a reason. We could have done selections from the Aeneid, but I think the Eclogues are this powerful expression of everyday life in poetic language. Again, nobody, even in the ancient world, nobody talked to the way the Latin that these shepherds taught, right? No shepherd talked the way these shepherds taught. But it does express these everyday desires. And before we close up, I want to add one more point. The rough and ready attitude that these shepherds display, their being okay with questionable behavior, typifies shepherds. And remember that it's the shepherds that the angels first appeared to when Christ was born. The angels didn't appear to Herod. They didn't even appear to the wise men. They appeared to shepherds, right? I know that the wise men searched their knowledge in order to follow the star to where Jesus was staying at that time, probably when he was 2 years old, or around 2 years old. I get that, I understand that. But the actual appearance of heavenly beings was to this rabble of ragtag people who may have even been in the middle of telling profane stories when the angels appeared to them. We don't know. We have no idea. but we know that, maybe they are the equivalent of construction workers, with apologies to construction workers, right? Members of my family are actually involved in that, but so I don't mean that in a negative way. But when we think of them, we think of people who are rough around the edges, and even though they may not be malicious, they may not be the most refined people in the world, and their coarseness can be off-putting to some of us, perhaps. That's what shepherds were, and those are the people to whom the angels appeared. So, meditate on that as a way to think about to whom the Lord reaches out. He reaches out to those who need Him, those who are not perfect, those who need a physician. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's our lecture for the week. I know it's long. We had a lot of literature to cover. Thank you for watching. Of course, I will write our exam questions based in part on the lecture material here as well as the writings, and I will see you all in the next unit.